discover about how often your students move around and how often they don't? Where do you see that you can let your students get the blood moving in their bodies by finding small pockets of time that they can simply stand up and stretch or walk around the room in figure eights? It's a magical movement that actually balances out the brain simply by following this infinity sign with their feet. Hopefully you're excited about just getting your students moving their bodies more often, because you can apply that to your learning environment immediately tomorrow. In this second half of lesson 2, we're continuing with the trigger of anxiety and still focusing on objectives now for older students. Let me ask you a question. When you write up a lesson plan, what are the objectives that you usually include immediately? Probably content objectives, right? You usually find them right from the bullet points of a publisher's chapter or from the district curriculum that you follow. How can you use these objectives proactively to engage your students and lower their anxiety? I believe you're going to find the answer right here, and this is going to change your life. Ready? I know you are. For upper grades, the content objectives are the ones we usually focus on. These are the ones we can use to negotiate with our students. So in the beginning of each session, we develop an atmosphere of collaboration, and it's easy and fruitful to make changes depending on our students' comments. We often forget that our students go from one class to another or one subject to another, and though we have the long-term vision of what we want them to accomplish, they often either don't know or they've forgotten. So having objectives visible for the session, the week, the month, the year, everything is very cognitively healthy. It's a way of reminding them what the connection is between the daily task they're doing and the long-term goals. What if the students decide that, for instance, in these objectives, they need time to work in pairs or groups before the class discussion? What if they give you a good reason to say that illustrating the key points in the experiment they just finished, or the session before or the week before, would add value to the class discussion? So could they do that first? I mean, these are responsible points and can be easily respected and changed. What do you think? And we also forget, or maybe a lot of us never knew, that sharing language objectives and making them visible are just as important as content objectives. We forget that the academic language and the transitional phases that we're used to and use constantly are very specific to the subject we're presenting. But our students either might be unfamiliar with them, or they might be so anxious about the different contexts and they won't be able to express themselves in a given topic. So that confusion creates a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety. If you want, please read a blog that I have on the page. It's uploaded in this folder for lesson 2, so you have a little more context on this topic. It's really interesting and really important. So if we share language objectives, confidence rises, anxiety decreases. And I alluded to this a little bit in the slide before. Another clarification regarding language objectives that will greatly reduce anxiety is to address the multiple meanings of words. Again, we're so used to them, we forget that they can be very confusing. We're so used to the vocabulary and academic language we use that, for instance, we forget that a word in math may mean something completely different in science, and those words in science may mean something entirely different in art. So just for instance, wind in natural sciences will mean the natural movement of air, whereas wind in art, spelled the same but pronounced differently, will refer to winding a string, or even in music when speaking about fixing the bow of an instrument, winding the chords. It's pronounced wind in natural science and wind in art and music and means something different. So it's not just a double meaning but different pronunciation. Now that would cause anxiety if we don't understand it, wouldn't it? You can download a list of some of the most common English words with multiple meanings in this folder for lesson 2. And you'll find more resources for academic language with multiple meanings for higher education in that section as well. Another trigger that blocks learning is low self-confidence. Students with low self-confidence or who judge themselves harshly don't want to make mistakes, especially in front of their classmates. And so, for instance, they won't raise their hand to answer questions, or they won't take chances so they don't make mistakes. You may be familiar with Carol Dweck's theory of the growth mindset. One of the key factors she encourages in this table of reframing messages is mistakes help me learn. So if we can instill this concept in the minds of our students, we do them an enormous favor. How exactly can we do that? I'm going to share an idea. We're going to celebrate mistakes. Joe Bowler, for instance, insists that making mistakes, especially in math, actually opens the tracks in the brain that wouldn't open without having made those errors and examining them how we arrived at them. Edutopia, one of the most respected educational resources, and by the way, sponsored by George Lucas, states that one way to encourage that attitude of celebrating mistakes is to take the most common mistakes that the class made on a test or a quiz and analyze them as a class. The more open everyone is about the mistakes they've made and how they happened, the less significance any students will place on future errors, and so anxiety goes down. And Dylan Wiliam, who is most famous for his black box books, also this book is incredible, has tens of ways to use mistakes as a way of moving students forward. One suggestion, for instance, is to mark only inappropriate answers on exams, then give those exams back to the students. They work together in groups to first explain how the students might have arrived at an inappropriate answer. Let's try not to use incorrect whenever possible. And two, what a more appropriate answer could be. They need to have clear explanations and justifications on both points. That's essential. We need that processing. So these are only 3 ways of normalizing mistakes so that the students see them as common, so they don't judge themselves so harshly for making them, and then they work collaboratively to standardize the answers so that classroom work becomes satisfying and forms positive connections of collaboration and support, and their self-confidence goes way up. And the third trigger that we're going to look at in this lesson that blocks learning is frustration and dissatisfaction. Students can become really frustrated when the assessment criteria for any task or exam is not clearly outlined. So for instance, they might think they're going to be assessed on handwriting, and in the end they're also assessed on punctuation. Or they think that they're going to be assessed on content, and then they find out that grammar also is being assessed. They might think they're being assessed on creativity, and then they find out they're also being assessed on structure. They might stay up all night studying conjugations of verbs and then find out that it's really a reading comprehension test. So whenever the assessment has not been clearly explained and co-agreed upon, the students need to know what they're going to be assessed on way beforehand, the students become frustrated and dissatisfied with the learning environment. And that is not our goal, is it? So what can we do to strengthen the affective domain in this sense? It's so logical and simple, it's surprising we don't automatically do it all the time. We just spend time outlining the criteria for each assessment clearly, have a co-agreement with our students that this criteria is fair according to the lessons that have led up to it, and that's what we go with. So those are only the first 3 common triggers that block learning and weaken the affective domain. You're going to learn more triggers, but more importantly, more activities that can mitigate those triggers and so strengthen the affective domain. How much fun is that? So go ahead and do the activity and the formative assessment for this lesson and see how much you've assimilated. And remember, you can adapt all of these activities and the scaffolds to your own lesson plans and the projects that you're going to be designing for phenomenon-based learning.